I'll briefly give an overview of the Eastern Africa Farmers Federation. We are a regional farmers organization. Regional in the sense that we have members that are national farmers organizations, national cooperatives, national commodity associations. And we have 23 of those in 10 countries. Briefly, that's our strategic plan. It has 4 pillars, one on agribusiness, another pillar on policy. We try and make sure we build capacity of our member organizations to engage effectively in policy processes. Another pillar on knowledge management. This is a picture from our resource center that we've just actually finalized. So in the process of getting publications inside there. It's also an online facility which we want to make as public as possible. And another pillar on institutional development. But the crux of my presentation is our engagement on a bill called the East African Community Cooperative Societies Bill. So that's the focus of this presentation. Yes. In fact, there's a newsletter here which came out from that process, which we produced from that process. There are copies at the back, so you'll be able to access those. It's from last year, August. Briefly about the East African Community, for those who don't know about it, it's a regional economic bloc, 5 countries, Burundi, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Uganda. It has an integration agenda that started from customs union all the way up to political federation. That's about a decade away. We're currently in the stage of a common market. It has a legislative function which is done through a parliament called the East African Legislative Assembly. I'll be referring to EALA quite a lot. So far, they've enacted 35 bills into laws. So it has a very strong legislative function. So what we're trying to do is advance this bill called the East African Community Cooperative Societies Bill through the East African Parliament, so it could be an act of parliament at the regional level. Very briefly, some of our members, this is just here to show that we have members that are national cooperative organizations in Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Uganda. In Burundi, they don't have a national cooperative, so the farmers organization is like the de facto national cooperative organization. Okay, to start with, we had to have a very, very clear justification of what we're doing. And we went through a kind of series of iterations, discussing with members, until we kind of cleared up this. We had this in our minds at the very beginning, but then towards the process, we had not really clarified and really distinguished why we're trying to do what we're trying to do. So I won't go through all of them. Just the first one is that because it's a bill at the East African Community, it has to respond to the treaty that establishes the East African Community. The treaty is like the constitution for the EAC. So what you're doing, if it's against what is in the treaty, it is dead on arrival. So that was one of the more core important justifications for us pushing this. I'll briefly explain what was done by way of timelines. And I've divided it into 3 different timelines. So the first timeline is 2009 to 2013. So I'm calling that phase the preparation phase. In that phase, we kind of had a clear justification as to why we wanted to do this. What's the problem we were addressing? We did a bit of research around that. Between those 3-4 years, without knowing it, we're building our relationship with the East African Community and with the East African Parliament. So we'd invite them for meetings like this one. They'd invite us for meetings. We'll ask to sit when they're having their sessions, the Committee of Agriculture. We'll present to them, and then we'll just get to understand how they work. We visited the Speaker, we visited the Secretary General, just to understand how they work. We did a lot of consultations. Many informal, many formal, many 1 day, many 10 days, many 1 month. So there's a whole process that was going on around there. The second phase was policy engagement. That's 2014. 2014 was the key year. It was a very key year, and I'll explain what actually happened in 2014. But that's when the bill actually went to Parliament. After that, more research was done, more consultations were done, a lot more consultations were done. And then we had public hearings. Now, public hearings is a parliamentary process. It happens at the national level, also at the regional level, you have to do public hearings. And then the redrafting of the law. That is the key step, and explain why it's the key step. Now, I'll call this next phase the post-parliament phase, because the bill was actually passed through Parliament in January this year, so now we're engaged in the process of strategic lobbying, very, very strategic lobbying, because after it is passed, it has to be signed by the presidents, then it's law. So we're now in the process of strategic lobbying, and we're trying to see how we can plan for its implementation. Okay, briefly, preparation phase. The cooperatives came to us at the East African level, saying that there's a problem with our national laws. And we said, okay, let's try and do a study and see what exactly is the problem. So we compared some laws within the region. We look at the Tanzania law, the Uganda law, Kenya law, and we kind of benchmarked it against the Ethiopian law. Ethiopia has a very good cooperative law, which they call the Cooperative Proclamation. So for the next 2 years, we were doing a couple of meetings, validating the research work we had done, it was actually a research report. It wasn't even a law at that point in time, but it was a research report that had elements of a law. In 2012, we went to visit the Speaker of the East African Parliament and the Secretary General, just to explain to them that, this is something we're thinking about, and they're the ones who said, you should actually bring this to us as a law, because it fits within the treaty, and it can actually be responded to at a regional level. So that's where the decision to actually move it from how it was before to an actual law. We appeared before the Committee of Agriculture in Parliament, the East African Parliament, and we presented it to them. Not by way of a law as it looks, but just elements of it and saying, with some justification and explaining what actually wanted to do. So we appeared before the committee in May 2012. Then in 2013, in April, one of the MPs said that he will advance it as a private member's bill. So bills can either go to Parliament as a private member's bill or through government. So the MP agreed to do that, and we supported him in that process. So we actually did all the background work, and for him to get the consent to actually move it, he had to get what is called a no objection from the council. Council is like the Attorney General in the East African community. So he had to get a no objection from the council. Now, that no objection was given after the council looked at the draft bill, looked at the research report, looked at all the documents we had used to justify the bill, about 20 different reports that he looked at. Then he said, yes, this is okay, you can actually advance it. And then thereafter, it was presented to the Parliament through this MP in October 2013. So at that point, it seemed to be an EAFF research report. It now became an East African Community bill. So it was no longer the property of EAFF. Those are pictures. The first picture, top left, is with the Secretary General. He's in the middle. On the left and right, that's the EAFF CEO and the EAFF President. And down here is a meeting with the Speaker. This is when we presented to the committee. Top right is the committee, top left is us. Okay? Now, the next phase, this was the heaviest year, 2014. I'll call it the policy engagement state. It was very, very intense last year. So the bill was read for the first time in Parliament in January. That was in one of their sessions in Kampala. Then between January and July, we had to manage a process of national and sub-national consultations. According to the EAC, the process is in the same at the national level. Once it goes through the first reading, it's given back to the committee. They say, go and do more consultations before the second reading. Now, because the EAC it's in countries, so you have to do these consultations in all of the countries. So depending on your budget, you go to the capital, you go to the villages, just to consult on this bill. The bill now, it's an EAC bill, so there's no mention of EAFF on that bill. So that process was done for a period of 6-7 months up to July, and then we did more research around that time. I put LTO there because LTO is a Dutch farmers organization. We have a very good relationship with them. And we called them on board just to give us an insight how the European cooperative regulations are. There's an EU regulation for cooperatives, which is also a regional one, but it's regulations. So we brought them on board to just give us some ideas how theirs works, how the cooperatives respond to it, and that kind of, it was helpful, but nothing much changed in terms of how our bill actually looks. Then in September, we had the public hearings. Now, the public hearings is a public meeting where you just make an announcement, having public hearings on this bill. Actually, it's the EAC who makes the announcement. It's not us who makes the announcement. And then people just come and give their comments on the bill and so on and so forth. But because we had managed the consultations very well through our members, the result of those consultations was actually a report of comments. So during the public hearings, that report of comments was just presented to the Parliament because they'd already done a systematic process of consultations. Then in October last year, we prepared the schedule of amendments. Actually, the EAC prepared the schedule of amendments. We were just part of that process. And I'll come back to that. These were consultations. This one is in Rwanda. This is in, I think, Tanzania or Uganda. I'm not very sure. This was a public hearing in Burundi. So the ones up there on the front row has the Minister for EAC Rwanda, EAFF President, the President of the Burundi Farmers Organization, the Chair of the Committee in East African Parliament, and then one of the MPs from the East African Parliament. Those were just people from the cooperatives. Okay, this was the 4 days we spent preparing the schedule of amendments. The schedule of amendments is a document that collects all the reports from the consultations, plus other reports that people may have submitted, either a memo, either comments and to the bill. So the bill was, to give you perspective, the bill was 35 pages, but the comments, when compiled, after they were compiled, it was 60 pages. So you have to now condense those 60 pages into the 35 pages to make a proper schedule of amendments. So a schedule of amendments is just a matrix saying the comment to clause A is this and the justification is this. So we ended up having, from the 60 pages, we brought it down to 30 pages of just comments. I highlight that gentleman there because he's the most important person in this process. He's not a politician. He's the principal legal draftsman of the East African community. So the team there were just 6 of us. I'm not taking the picture. The person next to him on the left in a white shirt is the MP who was fronting the bill. The 2 ladies are staff from the East African Legislative Assembly, a clerk and a secretary. The other guy is a lawyer who used to work with the cooperatives department here in Kenya. We brought him on board because he was very knowledgeable. So he writes the law. This guy writes the law. So every clause has to be justified. So you don't just say this clause should change to this without a solid justification. If he's not convinced, he feels it conflicts with another law, then it's dropped. You have to have a very clear justification for every sentence that appears in the law. So we worked on that with him for a period of 4 days or so. So post-engagement. In January this year, it went for the 2nd and 3rd reading. The 2nd and 3rd reading is when they read the schedule of amendments to the entire assembly, and they choose to pass it, amend it, or dismiss it. So it actually passed. March to September this year, we now had many meetings with the ministers because it's now passed by Parliament in January. The ministers now have to ensure that it is signed by the heads of state. Now, we have to push the ministers to push the presidents to sign the bill. So I call it strategic meetings. And we met with some of them, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda. We failed to meet the Kenyan minister, incidentally. Now, next week, we're having a meeting in Rwanda where we're bringing people from the ministry together, Ministry of Cooperatives, people from the Ministry of EAC together, and people from the Parliament, plus our members, to again push again, because you have to make sure that the thing gets signed. And sometimes it may not get signed because of a small problem. So you have to make sure that the ministers make sure that their presidents are aware that they have to sign. So leaving nothing to task, we want to really, really push them. So we're planning that next week. This is the meeting we had with the minister. The gentleman on the far right is the Minister of EAC. I don't know if he's still a minister because I think that they're announcing the cabinet next week, but he was the former minister for East African Community in Tanzania, and the rest is our members from the cooperatives from Tanzania. Okay, there's a lot of media engagement. We use the media a lot throughout the entire process. This is from Uganda, that's from Rwanda, the Rwanda Times, Tanzania Guardian. That building is actually the building for the Tanzania Federation of Cooperatives. That's their building. Down there, they're going to put their bank there. So they're quite a big cooperative in Tanzania. Business Daily, that's from Kenya. This is the New Vision. This lady is the minister in charge of trade and cooperatives in Uganda. Business, that's from The Nation. This is also from The Nation, Kenya. A lot of media engagement. So these are excerpts from the documents of Parliament, just announcing that the bill is going for the 2nd reading. Again, this is from the Parliament. Again, from the Parliament, when it was passed. So you can see they quoted our president when it was passed. What he said immediately the bill was passed. Okay, so the next steps, it has to be signed by the heads of state before it becomes law. So the summit, where the presidents will actually meet and sign, is scheduled for February next year. It was supposed to be next month, but then I think the Tanzania elections have actually pushed it because Tanzania is the chair of the EAC. So they want the president to settle in for a few months before he actually hands over to the next country. Also, Burundi has caused a delay because Burundi is supposed to take over as chair, but they're still uncertain about how it will work. So they're negotiating whether another country can take over as chair. So we have a meeting next week where we want to, again, update our members on the process. It's important that the members are so up to date with the whole process, how we are planning to move, how things are actually moving. We've invited the legal draftsman again to explain how the law is going to be adapted at the national level. That's why we brought guys from the ministries in the different countries. So he was going to explain to them that once it's passed, this is what you're going to have to do at the national level. A very, very detailed presentation which he's going to make. And then we're going to work with all of them to start developing a roadmap for the implementation before it's even signed. So we can even have that momentum and consensus to guide us when it's finally assented to. I'll put in brackets CASOA. CASOA stands for Civil Aviation Safety, Security, Oversight Agency. Now, it's to do with aviation. You're wondering why it's there. Well, this organization was actually formed from the EAC, from the Council of Ministers of the EAC. And in our bill, we're also proposing an agency, which is called the East African Cooperative Agency, which will have an oversight role on implementation of cooperatives. So we invited CASOA to explain to us how they're structured, how they link with the national civil aviation authorities, how they do all their work, how are they formed, how are they fundraising, how do they fundraise for themselves, how are their staff, how do they work. So I want them to explain to us the whole process of how they work, how they're governed, to guide us how we design the cooperative agency. This is how we set up next week. So if you want to come, you can come. A few lessons. A clear justification for the bill. This question hit us everywhere we went. When our members would go and meet the ministry will ask them, well, why do you want this bill? Because we had a very clear justification, it was easy to defend it. Otherwise, it would have been killed somewhere, somehow. It's the good thing with the East African community, things are very, very objective. There's no tribal issues at the East African level. It's objectivity and objectivity alone. Okay, a bit of politics comes in here and there, but objectivity usually rules the day. Ownership by our members. Our members had to drive the process within their countries, mobilize their cooperatives, convince the ministry, convince other cooperative actors, convince academic institutions. They had to manage the process at the national level. They wouldn't have done that if they didn't own the whole process from the beginning. You need to understand the whole process. We started understanding the process as we went along. This is the role of Parliament. This is the role of the draftsman. Make sure he's here at this meeting. If he doesn't come for this meeting, your bill is going to die. Know the role of the minister. Know how the minister talks to the president. Make sure he's informed at this point in time. We had to develop a very close working relationship with the MPs. Very, very close. We met them, I think, on more than 15 occasions in 2014, mostly as a committee, sometimes individually. Within us, we had to have very committed leadership on our side, because these big meeting with the minister is not done by me, but done by my chairman and my CEO. So they also need to understand the bill, defend it, understand the process, engage, and it's very, very complicated at times. Money, that was very, very important. I think it cost us about $400,000 from how we started up to maybe last year in total. We did this calculation with our finance officer, just a bit of, it's not completely accurate, but it's in and around there in terms of the public hearings, which was the most expensive, the country consultations, the research was cheap, ad hoc meetings were cheap, public hearings and country consultations were the most expensive. To give you a perspective, the public hearings, which is funded by you, us, involves moving the 15 members of Parliament, plus their 3 support staff, to each of the capitals for 2 days, each capital. So that gives you an idea. And you pay them allowances on their rates, not your rates. And they have their rates, which they usually have, which is in writing. It's not corruption, but you follow the rules. Okay, part 2, budgets. This is other stuff that we've been doing on agricultural budgets. We've been following the CADA process from the very, very beginning, engaging in the CADA process, understanding the issue of budgets, 10%, 6%, those targets, and we've never been convinced, unfortunately. So our objective has always been to see how our members can engage in their national budget processes very, very effectively. How are budgets made? Who makes them? How can they define what goes into the agricultural budget? How can they track? How can they monitor? And so forth. So we contracted a company called PKF. They're actually an audit company. And what they do is, I think they represent auditors when the ministry develops budgets. They have a role they play somewhere there, either as private sector or as auditors. And so they understand the budget making process very, very well. In most countries, I know in Kenya and Uganda, and I think Tanzania, they do it as well, immediately after the budget is read, they convene like a breakfast meeting and just unpack what's in the budget. So we contracted them to do the same thing for us, focusing on agriculture. As soon as the budget is read, okay, not as soon as, maybe like within the next couple of weeks after that, we task them to unpack it, what's the implications for agriculture, and then they go around together with us to the different capitals. Our members mobilize their members plus other stakeholders, and then they explain that process to the members. The members thereafter, they respond in terms of what's important for them. So one of the things we've learned from that process is that when we analyze the budget, we have to analyze it in detail. This 6%, 10% has never been useful, like I mentioned. We tend to go detail, what's the budget line? How much is going to this program? How much is going to this commodity? How much is going to A, B, C, D? And then we try and push our members to really, really engage. When the budget committees are actually meeting, go and observe those meetings. When the ministry calls for public meetings, go and participate in those meetings, even at the district level where possible. And then we also push our members to understand what we've come to know as special agricultural programs, and I'll have a couple of slides on this. We realize that most countries have special programs that are over and above the budget that goes to the ministry. And they're just listed, and I'll show you some examples. It's an extract from the special programs for Kenya, 2014-15, 2015-16. And many of them, we hear about them in the news, but we don't really know that they're special programs. There's an irrigation program, there's the Galana one near the coast, there's the input subsidy program, the grain reserves, money going to the peripheral sector, an agribusiness fund, land titling, and so on and so forth. These are all special programs, and there are more. So I could fit on the table here, all. I think they're twice the number that you see here. So we pushed our members to look at this and then now query. Okay, we're putting 3 billion, this is in billion Kenya shillings, so divide by 100 to get the dollars. 3 billion Kenya shillings on the input subsidy program. So what's actually happening? Who is managing that program? Is there a committee that manages it? And we push our members to try and get themselves onto that committee. These are the ones from Rwanda, last financial year and this financial year. On post-harvest, this is in Rwanda francs, tea expansion, land tenure, there's a beef project, and all these things. So we expose our members to them, and then we keep on pushing them and say, go find out what's happening in this beef program, in this nutrition support. If it's in a certain district where you have activities through your membership, try and get involved, or try and validate, try and see what's happening, try and track, and so on and so forth. Okay, so because we do it regionally, an advantage we have is that you can do a comparative. So one of the comparatives we did happened 2 financial years ago, when after doing all of this analysis, we realized that all the other countries have special programs, but Uganda at the time had no special programs. So the Farmers Federation then went to the Ministry of Agriculture and said, Kenya has special programs, Tanzania has special programs, Rwanda has special programs, we don't have special programs. And so they pushed and pushed and pushed. That was 2 or 3 financial years ago, I can't remember. And so I think last year they put in a few special programs. I don't know whether it was the sole result of the farmers, but at least we know that it empowered them to actually engage very specifically. In addition, there was a problem on VAT. The government introduced VAT on agricultural inputs, again, 2 financial years ago, I can't remember, this was in Uganda. And then the members again said, no, this is not possible. Kenya has no VAT. Tanzania had no VAT, okay, Tanzania introduced recently. Rwanda has no VAT, but why did we introduce VAT? So again, they pushed the ministry, and they also pushed the president, because in Uganda, every year they have a national agricultural show. And the president always comes or sends his brother or someone else to come for it. And so they pushed during such meetings. And as a result, we had this letter here, which was from the Commissioner General, from the Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, to the Commissioner General of the Revenue Authority, and saying, you can't read it, but then you'll get maybe the slide later, asking them to actually remove the VAT on inputs. Again, it wasn't the sole result of the Farmers Federation, but they contributed to actual pushing of it. So that was a good thing for us. Oh, that's the end, okay.